Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You're here because you want the essential shortcut to understanding global economics. And today we are tackling a really big one, a major paradox shaping our world right now.
That's right. It's this stubborn resilience, you could call it, of China's economic importance, despite, years of talk about decoupling, pandemic chaos, inflation. The sources we've looked at suggest China's place in the global supply chain isn't just holding steady, it might actually be more, well, central than ever.
Okay, so let's dig into that. We've got a stack of analysis here, basically claiming China is the unshakable center of global manufacturing. And the core argument, the thing we really need to test, is this idea that every major road leads to China. And trying to isolate China just ends up isolating yourself. That's a huge claim.
It really is. And it sets up this classic tension, doesn't it, between the structure of the global economy and political aims. So our mission today is to unpack what caused the recent crises in the West, and maybe more importantly, why these big efforts to shift production away from China seem to have, well, largely stalled out. What are the underlying reasons?
Let's start with that chaos everyone felt. I mean, for anyone listening in the U.S. or Europe, this wasn't just some abstract economic theory. It was right there on the shelves, wasn't it? U.S. inflation shot up, huge shortages. I remember seeing reports the U.S. Agriculture Department said Thanksgiving food prices jumped over 17% in just 1 year. Retailers warning about Christmas, limits on buying things. What caused that sudden breakdown?
Well, the sources point to basically four main things, all kind of tangled together. First, and this was huge, labor shortages. You had mass resignations, especially among those essential workers, think truck drivers, port workers, a lot of it tied to safety concerns during the pandemic. And that just clogged up the ports like crazy.
Right, so the actual movement of goods seized up because the people doing the moving stepped back.
Exactly, which leads straight into point number two. Skyrocketing logistics costs. I mean, the price to get one container from China to LA hit $20,000. That's, what, 4 times what it cost just the year before? Insane figures.
Wow. Okay, so labor and cost. What else?
Third was domestic monetary policy in the U.S. The sheer amount of currency printing definitely added fuel to the inflation fire, according to these analyses. And then the fourth factor, the sources are pretty direct about the ongoing impact of the trade war and unilateral policies.
Policies started under the previous administration, you mean?
Yes. The tariffs, the sort of protectionist moves. The idea was to hit Chinese producers, but the data suggests U.S. companies and consumers actually ended up bearing something like over 90% of the cost. So it arguably weakened the U.S. system before the pandemic even arrived, making it more vulnerable.
Okay, so some self-inflicted wounds there, politically, which makes the failure to decouple even more interesting. Let's talk about that strategy everyone was buzzing about, China plus one, move some production, maybe just assembly to Vietnam or India, spread the risk.
Yeah, it sounded good on paper. One source described it nicely, saying the idea sounded plump, but the reality turned out to be pretty bony. When big companies actually tried it, Apple suppliers, Samsung, Foxconn, they ran into a hard reality. They could move an assembly line, sure, but the crucial stuff, R&D, specialized suppliers, key services, that was all still deeply tied to China.
So the ecosystem wasn't really portable?
Not at all. And then, when the pandemic hit those new locations...
Right. What happened then?
Well, those relocated facilities often failed pretty quickly. Major shutdowns in places like India led to huge shortages that fed directly into things like the global semiconductor crisis for cars or shortages of parts for Apple phones. Vietnam and India just didn't have that dense web of infrastructure, the right kinds of ports, the sophisticated transport needed for that scale and speed. China did.
Okay, so that failure really points us to the core question here. If moving production didn't work out as planned, what is it about Chinese manufacturing that makes it so hard, maybe even impossible right now, to replicate? What are these pillars holding it all up? You mentioned 5.
Yeah, 5 key interconnected factors. The first one is maybe the most basic but critical, skilled human capital. China just has this enormous pool of highly trained workers and engineers. It's a scale that's hard to match. And the sources contrast this with, well, some reported challenges in the West. There was this one striking anecdote from a Singaporean investor.
Yeah, what did they say?
They mentioned looking into U.S. manufacturing investments and finding that in some areas, maybe up to half the potential workforce wasn't really suitable. Issues with basic literacy, numeracy, sometimes high rates of substance abuse, that's a fundamental problem if you need skilled labor.
Wow, that's sobering. You can have the best factories, but without the right people.
Exactly, which ties into the second pillar, infrastructure excellence. We're talking the whole package, high-speed rail, modern ports, highways, all run super efficiently, and the speed they build it is just remarkable. Remember that joke a U.S. politician supposedly made?
Vaguely. About a bridge.
Yeah, that China builds a bridge in 2 years while the U.S. spends 10 years just arguing about the name. It might be a joke, but it captures that speed advantage. It's a structural thing.
Okay, skilled people, amazing infrastructure. What's third?
Simple gravity, really. Market scale. China isn't just the world's factory, it's the world's biggest consumer market and a huge investment destination. If you're making stuff, being close to your biggest customer base just makes sense. It cuts costs, speeds things up.
Makes sense. And number 4, you said this was the real kicker.
This is what the sources really emphasize. Industrial clustering. This seems to be the truly unique advantage. Imagine needing anything for your product design help. A specialized component, testing, packaging, logistics, and finding it all within, say, a few dozen kilometers. That density, that ecosystem where everyone's interconnected, apparently no other country can really match that right now. It allows for incredible speed and flexibility.
That intense proximity. Yeah, you can see how that creates efficiencies others can't touch.
And the fifth pillar kind of enables all of this. Institutional support. A government that actively plans and supports industrial development long term. You see this even in the most basic tools of trade. Which brings us to this kind of wild fact, the container paradox.
Go on.
China makes over 96% of the world's dry cargo shipping containers.
Wait, 96% of the actual boxes.
That's what the sources state. Almost a total monopoly on the physical vessel of global trade. And here's the paradox. During the big shipping crisis, the global container shortage wasn't because China stopped making them. Actually, their production apparently surged like 235% in the first half of that year.
Oh, why the shortage?
Because the containers were stuck elsewhere. Massive pileups at U.S. ports meant empty containers weren't getting back to China fast enough. Chinese ports were starved of boxes because of blockages on the other side of the world. It just shows how reliant the whole global system is on the smooth functioning of that Chinese hub.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We've talked about the physical stuff, the workers, the ports, the containers, but what about the system itself? That institutional support, the coordination you mentioned as the fifth pillar. How does that translate into speed and efficiency, especially as we move more digital?
This is where you really see what the sources call systemic advantage. It's about the ability to marshal resources, capital, labor, political will, and focus them on huge national projects. Think about high-speed rail or the expressway network. China built the world's largest networks of both in about 20 years. Nothing else like it globally.
How do they achieve that kind of speed and scale?
It comes back to that coordinated approach. The sources mention policies focused on things like 6 stabilities and 6 guarantees, basically, ensuring stability in employment, finance, trade, supply chains, food, energy, even during shocks like the pandemic. It's about creating certainty.
So stability isn't just hoped for, it's actively engineered into the system. Does that carry over into digital infrastructure too?
Absolutely. China's way ahead in things like digital supply chain management, mobile payments. It's ubiquitous there. Compare that to the West. The U.S. still uses a surprising number of paper checks, right? And even in major U.S. or European cities, you can hit suburban areas or rural spots with patchy 4G, let alone reliable 5G. You just can't assume seamless digital coverage everywhere.
Why is there such a gap? Is it just the tech or something deeper?
The sources suggest it's partly ideological, about who pays for long-term infrastructure. In the West, private companies are often hesitant to invest heavily in, say, rural broadband if the return takes 20 years. It's not immediately profitable.
Whereas in China,
state-owned enterprises are often tasked with ensuring coverage even in remote villages. It's seen less as a pure profit calculation and more as a social responsibility that ultimately boosts the entire economy's efficiency, even if that specific village's connection doesn't pay for itself right away.
So it's a different calculation, national efficiency over individual profit. What about resistance? Do these sources mention anything holding back digital progress in the West?
They do, actually. They suggest that powerful lobbying groups in the financial sector can sometimes slow things down. Think about banks, credit card giants like Visa. They make billions from transaction fees, right? Their argument is that they might resist the kind of disruption that truly seamless, low-cost digital payment systems would bring. They have an interest in protecting the current fee-heavy system.
Huh. So existing players potentially blocking system-wide efficiency.
Oh, that's good
Tricky.
point.
And speaking of wider impact, you mentioned a really startling figure earlier about poverty reduction globally. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, it was striking. A British financial report, which one source claimed was sort of suppressed, apparently calculated that because of the sheer scale and low costs coming out of China's supply chains, for every one person lifted out of poverty within China, the global effect was that 1.3 people were lifted out of poverty worldwide.
1.3 globally for everyone domestically.
Hmm.
That's incredible. That single statistic really reframes the whole debate about economic impact, doesn't it? It suggests a massive, positive global externality from China's efficiency. Okay, we've covered the manufacturing dominance, the efficiency, but the sources also hinted that China, despite being this giant, still lacks maybe full pricing power in some key global markets. How does a manufacturing powerhouse start to address that, gain more clout?
That's seen as the next frontier, really. The sources explain that global commodity markets, things like coal, iron ore, maybe some high-tech components, often operate on two levels. You have the straightforward competitive market for, say, t-shirts, but then you have these other markets, often more speculative, where prices can be pushed around by financial players, not just supply and demand.
And China feels vulnerable to that speculation.
That seems to be the concern. But we saw a pretty clear example of how they're pushing back. Take coal futures recently. Prices were apparently being driven up by speculation, causing instability.
So what do they do?
The government stepped in pretty decisively, launched investigations into irregularities, yes, but crucially, they imposed direct limits on price movements, like a 15% cap up or down in a day. That effectively squeezed out the purely financial speculation and brought prices back in line with fundamentals. It's using institutional power to reclaim price stability.
Asserting control. But the challenges aren't just in these markets, are they? There's also this political dimension, what the source is called rule lock, trying to use international standards or regulations to block Chinese competitors in high-value sectors, like the C919 passenger jet you mentioned.
Exactly. That's seen as a major challenge. Refusing things like airworthiness certificates, using established Western standards as a barrier. The counter-strategy described is quite interesting.
How do they plan to get around that?
It seems to be two things. First, develop their own rigorous standards, potentially even higher than the existing international ones. Second, leverage that massive domestic market. If the C919 flies safely and reliably for years within China's huge internal market, carrying millions of passengers,
It built its own track record, makes it harder to ignore internationally.
precisely, it creates real-world validation and competitive pressure. Eventually, the thinking goes, competitors like Boeing and Airbus can't afford not to engage or find a compromise because the Chinese market itself is just too big to lose. Competence plus market scale becomes its own form of leverage.
It forces cooperation eventually. Okay, and that brings us to the final point on quality. The perception used to be cheap, but maybe not top quality. Is that shifting?
Dramatically, according to these sources. They cite observations from German industry experts, often seen as the benchmark, right, who apparently now say China's overall manufacturing capability gap has shrunk from maybe 10 years down to just 2 or 3. And in some specific advanced areas, China's already seen as having surpassed them.
2 to 3 years. That's incredibly fast convergence.
It is. And there are reports of major Western companies, like ABB mentioned in one source, getting seriously concerned about China's ability to substitute imports, meaning Chinese companies making machines that achieve, say, 80% of the performance of a top Western machine, but at only 50% of the cost.
Yeah.
That combination, rapidly improving quality plus unbeatable cost, is what really cements that unshakable center idea.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it seems the core message from these sources is that the stability we saw in China's supply chain, even through the pandemic, wasn't luck. It was the outcome of decades of deliberate national investment, that institutional coordination, the 6 stabilities approach you mentioned. It provides a kind of anchor in a really turbulent global economy.
Yeah, an anchor of certainty. And it brings us right back to that fundamental tension we started with, the clash between, let's say, functional economic logic, the drive for efficiency and profit, and these deliberate political choices aimed at antagonism or decoupling. We saw how political actions, like the trade war, definitely caused disruption and costs.
But the underlying economic structure proved incredibly resilient.
That's what the sources argue. Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty provocative question, I think.
Okay, what's the final thought for us to chew on?
It's this. In our deeply interconnected 21st century world, where supply chains are so complex, so reliant on specific geographic strengths like those industrial clusters, can politically motivated isolation actually work in the long run? Or does the sheer relentless force of economic necessity, this search for efficiency, for profit, for stability, inevitably push every major road back towards the most capable, most central hub? That dynamic is likely going to shape global economics for years to come, especially with things like the RCEP trade agreement further knitting together that Asia-Pacific, China-centric network.
A fundamental question indeed. Can politics override structural economics indefinitely? Thank you for bringing these sources in and letting us really get into the details behind that unshakable center claim. We hope this deep dive gave you the clarity and insight you were looking for. We'll talk to you next time.